They arrived just after dawn. The fog had not yet lifted, but already the smell had. Acrid smoke. Blood turned sweet in the heat. The soldiers, mercenaries from Saxony, were trained to look without flinching. But even they slowed their horses when they saw the forest. Not a forest of trees, of men, hundreds of them, stripped bare, impaled from groin to mouth, tilted at precise angles, their heads tilted back as if in mock prayer, their eyes glassy, mouths locked open in silent hymns of agony. The wind shifted, and with it came a sound that no one could explain. Not the moan of the dying. These men had been dead for days. Something else. Like breathing through hollow reeds. Like the trees were sighing. One rider dismounted and vomited into the brush. Another turned his horse around. No one stopped him. The captain spat and kept riding, through the path of corpses, through the orchard of punishment. He'd seen the aftermath of sieges, starved cities, cannibalized children. But this was different. This was not madness. This was order. The pikes were spaced evenly. The heights of the victims arranged from tallest in the center to shortest at the edges. Each man had a nameplate nailed into his thigh. Rank, crime, verdict. There were no women, no children, only soldiers, officers, bureaucrats. And one bishop, hung higher than the rest, his robes soaked in blood, his crucifix embedded into his chest like a brand. At the end of the path stood a man, young, barely 20, dressed not in armor but in a ceremonial robe of crimson and black. He stood beside a carved wooden throne, its legs still stained with travel mud. He did not sit. He did not move. He only watched as the mercenaries approached. One of the Saxon lieutenants dismounted and walked forward. He bowed deeply. The man nodded once. No words exchanged. They knew who he was. All of Europe did. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, son of the dragon. And in that moment, the forest had no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, only the flicker of flames from the torches planted in the earth like sentinels, light bending against the sharpened tips of wooden stakes. He finally turned to speak, but not to the soldiers, to himself. This was never supposed to happen. Not in anger, not in regret, but in something colder. Recognition. He stepped forward, slowly, between the rows of impaled corpses. He did not look at their faces. He already knew them. Every man had been interrogated, judged, sentenced. Every name matched to a betrayal, a debt, a warning, and now they stood taller in death than they had in life. The Saxon captain finally dared to speak. "Your Highness, our king sends his respect, and asks if this display is finished." Vlad's eyes moved, slow and deliberate, not toward the man, but past him, to the horizon, to the road that led back to Hungary, to Rome, to the empire that sent him away as a boy and expected him to return as a pawn. He smiled, not wide, just enough. "Finished?" he asked, his voice low. "No." He raised one gloved hand and gestured toward the edge of the clearing. There, 4 more stakes lay on the ground, freshly carved, the ends not yet stained. The message was clear. There would always be room for more. Behind him, a scribe in monastic robes recorded the moment. Every word, every nod, every sentence unspoken. He was one of 50 such scribes in Vlad's service. The prince understood something his enemies did not. Terror was not just a weapon. It was a story. One that traveled faster than armies. One that lodged itself in the hearts of kings. The soldiers departed before dusk. None spoke on the way back. And that night, as fires burned low in the great camp outside the forest, Vlad remained alone in the clearing, walking between the bodies, not counting, remembering. He paused beneath the bishop's stake. There was something in the bishop's left hand, a silver ring, still clutched tightly even in rigor mortis. Vlad took it, turned it over, a crest, one he hadn't seen in over a decade, and suddenly, for a flicker, the Prince of Impalers was no longer a sovereign. He was 11, barefoot in the sand, surrounded by laughter that wasn't friendly, words in a language he didn't know, bound wrists, mock prayers, and a whisper in the night, "You're not their son anymore." The forest crackled as the wind shifted, and the loop began to close, because monsters don't rise from nothing. They are built, and somewhere, between a boy given away like a treaty and a man who wrote history in blood, someone taught him what fear could do. The question was not why Vlad impaled his enemies. The question was, who showed him how? The last peaceful day began with the scent of wet stone and orchard wind. Vlad ran barefoot through the courtyards of Targovishte, his breath rising in thin clouds as the sun crept over the turrets. The castle had always felt too large in the morning, its empty corridors echoing with a silence that only deepened as the years passed. But outside, where the horses were watered and the falcons kept, it still felt like a kingdom worth inheriting. He was 11 and already fluent in Latin and Greek. His tutors called him gifted. His father, rarely present, called him useful. Today, he had bested his older cousin in swordplay, then recited 3 verses of scripture in flawless Hungarian. The servants clapped. The guards watched. And somewhere in the upper tower, his father wrote letters with wax seals that reeked of desperation. Wallachia, as always, stood on a knife's edge, between Hungary and the Ottomans, between Christendom and the Crescent, between loyalty and extinction. That morning, Vlad did not know any of this, but he felt it, in the way his father avoided eye contact at dinner, in the way men spoke in hushed tones outside the council chamber, in the way his younger brother clung to him tighter than usual, like a dog that sensed a storm before the clouds came. His father was a ruler, yes, but one with too many enemies and not enough friends. Promises had been made to both crowns, taxes paid to both sultans and kings, but diplomacy frays quickly in the hands of the weak, and Vlad Dracula had grown weak. That evening, when the boy was summoned to the great hall, the torches had already been lit. His brother Radu sat beside him, legs swinging nervously. Their father paced the room without his crown. That was the first sign something was wrong. The second was the absence of food. "My sons," the man began, "we are at war." Vlad sat straighter. Radu stared at the floor. "Not a war of swords," their father continued, "but of survival. We are not strong enough to fight, but we are wise enough to endure." The boys exchanged glances. Then came the words they would never forget. "You will go to Edirne as guests of Sultan Murad." Radu flinched. Vlad didn't move. He had heard the word before, guest. It was the lie noblemen told each other when giving their sons away. It meant hostage. It meant bargaining chip. It meant that their lives now belonged to someone else. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. His father noticed. "It will not be for long. You will be well fed, educated. You will return stronger than when you left." But even then, Vlad understood. No one sends strength to their enemies. Only sacrifices. The next morning, he was not allowed to say goodbye to the servants. A single carriage waited at the gate, its wheels wrapped in furs to muffle the sound. Inside, dried figs and silk cushions. Outside, silence. His brother cried for most of the journey. Vlad did not. He watched the trees recede into mist, The turrets disappear behind the bend of the road. The castle grows small enough to crush between two fingers. By dusk, it was gone. And so was the last peaceful day. The carriage wheels shifted from mud to marble as they crossed the threshold into Edirne. Vlad leaned forward, eyes wide as the palace unfolded in layers. Minarets that cut the sky like daggers, domes that glittered even in cloudlight, courtyards so clean they reflected the horses that passed over them. The guards at the gate didn't shout. They didn't scowl. They didn't look at him at all. That was the first difference. In Wallachia, men noticed princes. Here, the silence was a message. He was not important, not dangerous, not real. Inside, the walls were covered in silk, embroidered with scenes of conquest, prayers written in gold. Slaves moved without sound. A boy, barely older than Vlad, walked past him wearing rubies sewn into his collar, eyes lowered, hands stained with ink from transcribing verses he could not read. The air smelled of jasmine and ink, old leather and metal oil. 2 eunuchs led them past 6 different thresholds, each more ornate than the last. On the 5th, Radu stumbled. Vlad caught his arm. Neither eunuch turned. At last, they stopped at a small marble basin where water flowed from the mouth of a lion carved in obsidian. "Wash," one said. It was the first word spoken since their arrival. They washed, then walked another hour in silence, and then they saw him. Sultan Murad II, sitting on a low throne, legs folded beneath him, eyes dark and rimmed in kohl. He did not stand. He did not smile. He simply stared. A translator approached, spoke softly in their language. "You are safe here," he said. "You are to be honored guests." The phrase curled around Vlad's ribs like a hook. Honored guests, like honored debtors, honored fools. The Sultan lifted a hand. The audience ended. They were led away to a chamber with high ceilings and narrow beds. One guard stood at the door, another behind it. Radu curled into a corner. Vlad stood at the window. He could see nothing beyond the latticework. Only sky, a pale, foreign sky. Later, a scribe came with food. Lamb, rice, figs. He did not speak. When Vlad reached for a second bowl, the scribe pulled it away. "One," he said. Vlad returned to his bed. That night, he dreamed of their castle in Targoviste, of the orchard outside the chapel, of his mother's face, though it had already begun to blur in memory. He woke before dawn. A boy his age was already standing at the door. Dressed in Ottoman robes, he introduced himself in Latin. His name was Kem. "You're not here to learn," he said. "You're here to be unlearned." Vlad frowned. "What do you mean?" Cem leaned closer. "You are not a prince here. You are a message. And they don't write messages in ink, they write them in obedience." The next days passed in ritual, lessons in language, in poetry, in swordplay. Always watched, always judged. When Vlad hesitated during archery, a guard whispered something to the tutor. The next day, the target was painted with a red line. "Aim for the throat," they said. At dinner, they were separated. Radu began to smile more. He learned Turkish quickly. He played chess with the tutors and laughed at the right times. Vlad watched in silence. The walls of the palace were beautiful. The people inside were not. No one hurt them. No one beat them. But every glance, every word, every silence reminded Vlad, "You are not home, you are not whole, you are not free." One night, he snuck to the window again. The moon was full. Below, he saw a garden filled with white-robed men bowing in prayer. Beyond them, torches. Beyond that, darkness. In that moment, it hit him, not like a scream, but like a slow hand closing around his throat. He was not a gift. He was a threat held on a leash. If his father betrayed the Sultan, they would die. If he obeyed, they would live long enough to be forgotten. That was the contract, and everyone knew it but him. The palace glittered with stolen suns. Gold leaf on the ceiling, velvet rugs underfoot, mosaics that bled blue and crimson like stained glass torn from a cathedral. The guards bowed in perfect synchronization. Servants refilled goblets before thirst could surface. It was a place without stumbles, without accidents. Everything was watched, everything was measured. And yet, for all its grandeur, the court felt hollow, like a masterpiece painted over a dungeon wall. Vlad awoke each morning to the call to prayer, not for his god, but theirs. The sound rolled through the corridors like smoke, and the eunuch would appear without knocking. Every day, the same routine: rise, wash, dress in robes not his own. Follow silently. No conversation, no expression. By sunrise, he was seated with the others, sons of defeated princes, failed rebels, and vanished kings, all dressed alike, all taught to nod at the same moments. The lessons were endless: Turkish, Arabic, mathematics, Quranic verse, history rewritten with a smiling blade. When he hesitated on a word, the tutor's rod struck his knuckles. When he paused in a prayer, the room fell still. Then came the punishment, not loud, not crude, just 3 sharp lashes behind the wall. No screaming, no explanation. The pain was not the point was rhythm, conformity, ritual. Vlad learned the words, but not their meaning. He mouthed the prayers, but clenched his teeth behind each syllable. The other boys, most younger, most already broken, drifted toward obedience like leaves toward a river. They smiled when told, bowed when watched, memorized what was asked. Sem, the boy who'd warned him, faded into that current too. "It's easier," he whispered one night. "You'll bleed less if you just become what they want." Vlad didn't answer. He stared out the lattice window, hands folded in defiance. His bones ached with growing, with hunger, with rage he couldn't place. He began to mark the days by the birds that came to the sill. A crow meant pain. A sparrow meant silence. A dove never came. The eunuchs noticed. When he spoke out of turn, they removed his food. When he looked a guard in the eye, they took his mattress. When he refused to kneel during prayer, they took his voice, not with force, but with quiet. He was moved to a cell with thicker walls. He was kept from Radu. No one told him why. The worst punishment was not the lash. It was absence, silence, nothing. Days without a word, nights without footsteps. Meals passed through a grate without faces. The world shrank to the width of 4 walls and a ceiling that flickered with candlelight like a mocking star. But Vlad did not break. He whispered prayers in Latin under his breath, words the walls could not understand. He scratched the names of saints into the stone with the bone of a chicken. He dreamed of rivers, of frost, of blood-red banners flapping over castle turrets. And always, always, he remembered his father's face, not proud, not tearful, just resigned. The look of a man who'd bartered away his sons and hoped one would forgive him. That look became a fire. He no longer flinched when the rod fell. He stared past the tutors as if memorizing their weaknesses. He spoke Turkish fluently now, not with reverence but precision, like a blade that learned to speak. One day, a general from the Sultan's court visited. He watched the boys recite poetry and spar with dulled blades. Vlad stood out, not because he smiled, because he didn't, because his eyes didn't lower. because he moved like he'd already seen death and knew its timing. "That one," the general whispered to the eunuch. "He will be useful someday." Vlad heard, and for the first time he smiled. Not with joy, but with teeth. The cage was velvet, but the velvet had worn thin. He could see the bars now, and he was learning how to bend them. Radu's voice had changed. Softer, rounder. He no longer winced at the call to prayer or stumbled over foreign syllables. He wore the Ottoman robes like silk had been stitched into his skin, like he'd been born beneath a crescent moon instead of a cross. He walked with grace now, ate with the right hand, bowed his head at just the right angle when the tutors passed. He laughed sometimes, loudly, too easily. Vlad watched all this from across the training courtyard, silent, unmoving, like a statue cracked beneath its own weight. They were still housed in the same palace wing, but the world between them had changed. Radu belonged to this place now. He played chess with the vizier's sons. He spoke Turkish even when no one was listening. He prayed with the others, forehead to marble, and when he stood up, he smiled like nothing had been taken from them. Vlad couldn't bear it. He no longer sat beside Radu during meals. He didn't speak to him after lessons. Their rooms shared a wall, and some nights, Vlad would press his ear to it and hear his brother laughing with the other boys. The laughter carved something jagged in his chest. Their teachers noticed. One morning, during sparring practice, they were paired together. The sun burned white above them. The other boys circled in quiet anticipation. Vlad stood tall, his wooden blade steady. Radu hesitated. His grip was light. The tutor barked, "Begin." Radu stepped forward, cautious. Vlad didn't wait. He struck hard, fast, a blur of fury and precision. Radu blocked once, twice, then stumbled. The third blow knocked him to the dirt. A red line opened across his collarbone. The tutor stepped in, eyes wide. "Enough!" But Vlad had already dropped his blade. His face was blank, cold. Radu sat in the dust, clutching his shoulder, staring up in betrayal. That night, Vlad returned to his cell and stared at the wall until dawn. He wasn't sorry. In the weeks that followed, Radu stopped trying. He didn't sit beside Vlad in the study hall. He didn't speak during meals. He became softer still, gentler, quieter, almost invisible. The guards liked him. The tutors praised him. The vizier himself once said, "He has a noble heart." Vlad almost laughed. A noble heart meant little in a world built on swords and silence. Vlad, on the other hand, was a problem. He refused to chant the Quran aloud. He spoke only when spoken to. During archery practice, he refused to shoot unless ordered twice. One tutor claimed he was slow. The next week, he outscored every boy in sword drills. The guards began to whisper. "He learns like fire," one said. "You can't teach fire, only direct it." The Sultan heard. One morning, a royal guard fetched Vlad from his chamber and led him through a new part of the palace, colder, quieter, lined with columns that stretched like ribs into shadow. At the end stood the Sultan, not on a throne, but beside a table. Maps, scrolls, and swords were laid out in neat lines. Murad, too, did not look up. He pointed to a map of Wallachia. "Your home," he said. "Your father bends easily. Will you?" Vlad said nothing. The Sultan turned. His gaze was not cruel, but curious. "You resist, but resistance is not strength, it is pain, with no plan." He gestured to the scrolls. "These are letters from your father. He calls you a prince. But I call you something else, potential." Vlad's jaw tightened. Murad leaned in. "One day you may return. Not as a child, but as something greater. But only if you learn. Vlad returned to his quarters that night with a quiet storm behind his eyes. Radu was waiting. For the first time in weeks, he spoke. "They trust me now. I could ask for favors, even help us." Vlad cut him off. "Help? You think they'll let us go because you smile at the right time? You're not helping, you're becoming them." Radu stepped back. Hurt flickered in his face. "They treat me well because I listen, because I respect them." "No," Vlad said coldly, "because you kneel." That was the last time they spoke in that palace. One brother learned how to blend in. The other learned how to become unforgettable. The nights changed first. The tutors no longer dismissed them after sunset. The eunuchs no longer allowed lamps in their chambers. And the guards, once content to loiter outside, now moved through the palace like shadows with keys. Vlad noticed. He always noticed. The others had begun to accept it. Whispers after curfew, boys taken for questioning, then returned with blank stares and bruises that didn't match the explanations. It began slowly, isolated interrogations, forced confessions, drills done in darkness. Then came the experiments, games they called them. Lessons in loyalty, ropes, blindfolds. Orders barked in languages half-learned. Mistakes punished with silence or steel. One night the courtyard filled with smoke. The boys were dragged from their beds and forced to kneel around a fire. A sack was thrown open. Inside, scrolls, holy symbols, books in languages forbidden by the court. "These are lies," the guard said, lifting a crucifix. "And those who protect lies burn with them." He tossed it into the flames. The smell of wood and metal mixed with something older. Older than faith. Older than fear. Vlad stared at the fire, unmoved. Radu looked away. The next week, the games escalated. The boys were bound at the wrists, lined up against the wall. They were told, "The enemy tortures. The enemy lies. The enemy is your neighbor." And then, without warning, the guards would stage mock executions. Swords drawn, throats nearly touched, screams wrung out like towels in a basin. Some cried, some vomited. Vlad remained still. His heart raced, but his face never betrayed it. Every moment taught him something, how they moved, where the torches were, which guard's hand trembled on the hilt. He became a ghost in the palace. He stopped speaking altogether, not from trauma, but calculation. The fewer words, the less they could measure him. He watched the cooks in the morning, learned the routines of the guard rotations, mapped the echo of each hallway in his sleep. And when he wasn't watched, he wandered, barefoot and soundless, through the cold stone arteries of the compound. The palace became a body, and he learned its pulse. One night he followed a whisper, not a voice, but the shuffle of feet too cautious to be a guard's. He found a boy, no older than 9, curled in the dark beside the baths, crying without making a sound. The boy had a broken hand. Vlad didn't speak. He tore a strip from his own sleeve, bound the boy's fingers, and left. No one would know, but the boy would remember. Another night, the guards dragged a boy from the dormitory. Screaming, clawing. They called it punishment. Vlad waited until dawn, then traced the path of bloodstains back through a service corridor. They led nowhere. The boy never returned. The fear became a language, and Vlad became fluent. He began testing the limits, standing a few seconds longer after curfew, eating half his meal and watching where the rest went, asking the youngest boys what they dreamed of, then watching how fast they stopped speaking after. He learned who the traitors were, who passed messages, who beat the others when the tutors weren't looking. He remembered every name, and he began to smile. It wasn't joy. It was the kind of smile that says, "I understand now." Because he did. They weren't just breaking boys. They were sculpting them, sanding down identities, polishing them into weapons with the Sultan's seal engraved in bone. "They want us to become something," Vlad whispered to the shadows one night, "but they've forgotten." He reached down, brushed the dust off the St. Michael medallion still hidden beneath his robe. "We were never clay." By the time he turned 15, the boys feared him more than the guards did. He walked alone, ate last, slept lightly, and the tutors, though they never admitted it, stopped correcting him. Because now he corrected them. He recited doctrine back to them with perfect precision, then stared long enough to make them question their own teachings. The guards called him the Quiet Blade. The eunuchs said, "He sees too much." The Sultan's spies wrote, "He will either kneel or burn us." But Vlad was not interested in revenge. Not yet. Revenge meant they mattered. He wanted something colder. He wanted them to remember they never broke him. That their hands, bloodied and trembling, only taught him how to wield fear with more grace than they ever could, and when he returned home, they would see what they had made. He had been watching for months, quietly, without stepping forward, like a crow perched just beyond the firelight. Some said he was a priest. Others whispered he'd once been a general who lost his tongue to betrayal, but the truth was stranger. He was both. A man with the authority of Scripture and the scars of war. He entered the palace rarely, only for special sessions. The boys called him the Gray, never raised his voice, never gave second chances. When he appeared, silence fell like frost. The first time he spoke to Vlad, it wasn't to correct him. It was to ask a question. "What would you do if given your brother's place?" Vlad didn't answer. The Gray smiled. "You don't have to say it. I can already see it in your eyes." He began appearing more often after that. Not to the whole class, just to him. Lessons came in fragments, delivered like secrets. Power is not taken. It is given, then regretted. Or loyalty is the lie that fear wears when it wants to feel noble. One day, he handed Vlad a knife and placed an apple in front of him. "Now, take it without bruising the skin." Vlad hesitated, sliced it open so slowly the room held its breath. "Good," the Gray said. "Precision before rage, always." Their meetings moved to quieter places. Abandoned gardens, unused libraries, stone alcoves that echoed only when lies were told. The Gray brought books not on prayer, but on administration, espionage, and rhetoric. Scrolls written by men whose names were stricken from record. The ones who built empires, he said, not the ones who claimed them. But it wasn't just knowledge. He trained him in decisions, cruel ones. A rat in a cage with two levers. One delivers food, the other delivers pain to a second rat. "You can't free them both," the Gray said. "So which one do you feed?" Or a list of names, 5 guards. One is leaking secrets. Vlad must choose who to punish. No evidence, no time. "This," the Gray said, "is governance." Vlad learned, not just how to read a face, but how to fold his own expression into a weapon. Not just how to speak, but when silence would bruise deeper than words. He memorized treaties, tax codes, poison doses, genealogies of noble families he would one day face or manipulate. And he never asked why. Until one night, deep in the catacombs of the palace, beside a cracked wall filled with dust and faded graffiti from boys long buried, the Gray finally said it. "You think you're here to survive. You're not." Vlad watched him, motionless. "You're here to return." It wasn't a suggestion, it was prophecy. Vlad didn't smile, didn't blink. He whispered, "I know." The gray nodded, almost proud. "Then you must remember. Men are not afraid of death. They're afraid of shame, of weakness. Show them a blade and they'll resist. Show them their reflection, and they'll fall to their knees." After that, the lessons turned darker. Vlad was taught not just how to kill, but when not to. How to let a traitor live just long enough to make others doubt. How to forge a confession. How to orchestrate mercy so precisely that it created more fear than executions ever could. "Mercy is a message," the Gray said. "Make it bleed." He practiced speeches, practiced silences, practiced war. One day, the Gray walked him to the highest point in the palace, where the towers met the sky and pointed toward the horizon. "That way lies Wallachia." Vlad said nothing. "Your father is aging, your brother is already theirs, but you—" He turned to face him fully. "You could be more than a prince. You could become memory, something that haunts the ones who forgot what your name once meant." Vlad finally spoke. "My name," he said, "is not forgotten. It was stolen." The Gray's eyes gleamed. "Then take it back, with both hands." That night, as he descended the stairs alone, Vlad ran his fingers along the cold stone banister, counting each groove carved into it, each step, each crack, like they were stitches in a wound he would never let heal. He no longer flinched when the guards barked commands. He no longer stared when boys disappeared. He no longer dreamed of freedom, because he had learned the greater truth. Freedom was not given. It was built, stone by stone, word by word, body by body. He would return, but not as the boy they had taken. He would return as the consequence. They say the gates of Wallachia opened on a morning wrapped in mist, the kind of mist that clings to memory, not skin. His procession was quiet. No banners, no trumpets, just the steady rhythm of hooves and a face no one recognized, or rather, a face they remembered wrong. The boy who had left them years ago had vanished into Empire. The man who returned wore the same name, but nothing else fit. His hair was darker, eyes sharpened by silence. He rode at the center of a foreign-styled retinue, silent as the mountains behind him. His brother did not greet him. His father no longer could. The nobles approached first, uncertain whether to kneel. Some did. He didn't acknowledge them. The throne room hadn't changed. Same tapestries, same gilded icons, still pretending that time had stood still. But the boy, who had once stood small beside his father's throne, was gone. What returned was a man who didn't need the chair to feel power. He stood in front of it and stared. No ceremony, no prayers, just a single sentence. "Those who spoke in my absence may now be silent." His first orders were confusing. He closed the roads for 3 days. No trade, no messengers, just silence. Then he summoned the local boyars, the nobility. Not all came. Those who did found the hall dim, cold, stripped of its usual gold. No food, no music, just him. He sat at the end of the table, flanked by no advisors. He asked for a list, names, landowners, tax evaders, allies of his brother. The scribes hesitated. "Write what I say," he told them. One by one, the names were read aloud. No accusations, no trials, just names, falling into the candlelight like condemned prayers. The next day, those named vanished. No blood in the streets, no public gallows, just emptiness, doors left ajar, horses untethered. Villagers whispered of carts leaving at night. No one returned. He instituted new rules. Foreign merchants must tithe at the border. Priests must account for every coin given in alms. Monasteries were taxed. The nobility howled. He summoned them again. This time, the meal was grand, lavish, decadent, almost absurd. Wine flowed. Laughter was encouraged. He toasted their health, listened to their grievances, then locked the doors. The hall burned by morning. His soldiers said he stood outside and watched the flames without blinking. When asked why, he answered, "A forest grows stronger when the rot is cleared." Word spread like wildfire wrapped in parchment. The Ottoman court, who had once kept him as a guest, now watched carefully. Their quiet observer had returned with venom behind his teeth. He wrote letters to the Sultan in perfect Turkish, polite, cold, promising allegiance but never trust. In Wallachia, the peasants whispered his name in two ways, one with fear, the other with awe. Children were told to obey, lest he send for them. Officials who stole grain vanished overnight. Thieves were not jailed. They were made example of, bodies left where temptation had once lived. His laws were brutal but effective. Crime stopped. Trade stabilized. But no one smiled anymore. He restructured the church hierarchy, silently replaced bishops, built fortresses in places no one expected, reinstituted border patrols with soldiers who answered only to him. All records of his brother's influence were erased, names chiseled off stone. The past, he said, should not be remembered with affection. But it was his eyes that disturbed the court most. Not for what they saw, but for what they ignored. Suffering didn't move him. Praise didn't touch him. Only silence, the kind he had learned in corridors of pain, seemed to soothe him. And he never laughed, except once. A messenger from the east arrived, an envoy from his former captors. They brought a request, tribute, allegiance, gold. He invited them to dine. When they refused to remove their turbans, he smiled for the first time in months. "Then let them be nailed to your skulls," he said. No one heard screams that night. Only carpenters, quietly at work. Afterwards, he walked through the town barefoot, speaking to no one, stopping only once, to stare at a statue of his father. He looked up at it for a long time, then turned and walked away. No words. It was clear by then to everyone. He had returned, but not as their prince, as something else. Something colder than vengeance, sharper than grief, something the empire had not broken, something it had forged. They called him a ruler, but that word had never meant less. Kings ruled with decrees. He ruled with shadows. Paranoia wasn't a symptom of his reign. It was the system itself. Men turned on their neighbors before whispers reached the palace. A look, a delay, a hesitation was enough. Because he had learned, long ago in the marble corridors of a foreign empire, that fear travels faster than truth and deeper than loyalty. His forests changed. They no longer bore fruit, but warnings. Whole groves became graveyards of demonstration. To ride through Wallachia was to witness a kingdom not of men, but of silence and stakes. Sometimes dozens, sometimes thousands. Each body placed with deliberate care, angled just so, rotting in the sun not as punishment, but as punctuation. A message etched in blood across the landscape. He remembered how they'd taught him, not with logic, but spectacle. Public floggings that ended in applause. Boys forced to watch executions, not to punish the condemned, but to sculpt the watchers. Fear shapes faster than faith. And now, he was the sculptor. Visitors arrived and left pale, trembling. A Hungarian envoy wrote, "This is not a court, it is a performance of madness." But what they called madness, he called design. He had seen empires ruled by indulgence and betrayal. This was different. This was rule through memory. At night, his spies moved like smoke. Some brought reports, others brought teeth. Nobles dined in silence, unsure if the meat was safe. Bread was tested, wine watched. Some stopped eating altogether, losing weight not from famine, but from dread. Yet the country did not collapse. Roads were built. The poor paid less in tax than ever before. Grain moved swiftly. Crime vanished. Border towns once ravaged by Turkish raids now stood fortified and disciplined. But it came at a price. The kind of peace that trembles. He kept no court jester, no favorite mistress, no circle of friends. Only guards, and even they were rotated constantly. No one saw him twice in the same mood. Sometimes he would walk the city disguised as a commoner. Other times, he'd stare from his castle for hours without blinking, eyes fixed on some invisible enemy only he could see. It was said he no longer slept, that his dreams were filled with things unspeakable. But more terrifying was the rumor that he did sleep, and dreamed of all this before it ever happened. His brother, they said, had grown soft under Ottoman silk, a puppet in the East. But Vlad had returned wrapped in iron, forged in the Empire's cruelty, and now turned its methods back on the world that had abandoned him. He wasn't just resisting their influence, he was reflecting it. And it worked. Armies hesitated. Spies defected before being caught. Ottoman messengers demanded his removal, but their replacements arrived weeks later with fear already trembling in their hands. Europe, which once ignored his homeland, now stared, but it wasn't admiration, it was calculation. "How do you stop a man," one diplomat asked, "who believes death is not a punishment but a tool?" No one answered, because he didn't just kill, he chose how they died. A merchant caught cheating peasants wasn't hanged. He was forced to eat every coin he'd taken one by one until his lungs gave out. A traitor priest was not executed. He was stripped naked and chained inside a hollowed chapel, made to hear his own sermons echo until madness broke him. Each death had meaning. Each meaning had a purpose. Because that was the final lesson he had learned, not from war, but from captivity. Pain alone fades. But meaningful pain? That lingers, that rewrites the future. He did not rule to be loved. He ruled to be remembered. And when foreign generals discussed him behind locked doors, they did not use his name. They called him the Impaler, not as insult, but insurance. A way to speak without summoning, but he wore it like armor, because, to him, it meant they'd seen the message and understood. It started with murmurs. Low whispers passed between merchants at dusty borders, scribes in candlelit monasteries, courtiers in foreign palaces. A name spoken too loudly could silence a room, not the name his mother gave him, not even the title etched in Latin across treaties, but something older, darker, forged in fire and wrought. Tapi, the Impaler, a name not of lineage but of legend, a symbol of what happens when a boy meant for virtue is broken, reshaped, and crowned by fear. In the marketplaces of Hungary, children stopped laughing when dusk fell, looking over their shoulders for a pale rider with iron eyes. In the woods of Transylvania, hunters swore they saw figures nailed to trees, days after any soldier had passed through. In the courts of Western Europe, his image appeared in pamphlets, half man, half beast, sitting atop pyramids of corpses, feasting on the blood of the damned. Protestants used him as proof of Catholic brutality. Catholics whispered he might be the devil the East had sent to judge them all. But in Wallachia, it was different. There, the story was a choice: hero or horror. Some villagers left offerings by roadside shrines carved in his likeness. Others scratched his symbol into their thresholds, not to ward him off, but to honor what he protected. Justice, they called it. Order. Even if it came drenched in red. Yet none truly knew him. Not the priests who cast his reign in sermons, not the historians who penned volumes about his cruelty, not even the soldiers who followed his commands without question. Because the man they feared was not the boy who once ran barefoot through orchards, reciting Latin prayers with hope in his chest. That boy had died in a palace with golden walls and silent halls. The man that emerged, shaped by betrayal, humiliation, and mockery, was not born cruel. He was trained to survive in a world where mercy was weakness and trust was a noose. He didn't invent the horrors of his time. He inherited them, and then wielded them better than anyone else ever had. His legend spread faster than armies. Painters depicted him seated on thrones made of bone, surrounded by fire and ravens. Writers who had never seen Wallachia described him impaling whole cities, drinking blood, cursing heaven. Every tale twisted the truth, because the truth wasn't what people wanted. They wanted a monster, something to blame, something to fear, something that made sense of their own brutal world. And so they built one. He became their mirror, a reflection of everything they couldn't explain: the cruelty of kings, the silence of God, the frailty of order. If he hadn't existed, they would have invented him. Because only a legend could survive the truth they refused to face. That power, when forged in suffering, doesn't return with forgiveness. It returns with memory, and memory, when sharpened, cuts deeper than any sword. Even now, centuries later, the echoes haven't died. Tourists stare at rusted cages that once swung from castle walls, asking if he really was that cruel. Scholars debate whether the numbers were true. Some say he killed 20,000, others say 40, some say more. But the truth, as always, is less important than the echo. The story, because the story still walks. Through cracked pages, through whispered warnings, through every cold look cast from a throne where kindness is weakness. He is the line between order and terror, the scar the empire carved into its own skin. The boy who learned that survival means becoming the thing they fear most. He didn't ask for blood, they spilled it. He didn't seek vengeance, they taught him how. He didn't want to rule in fear. But when fear is all they understand, you crown yourself with it. And in the end, when his body was gone and the borders changed, when the palaces crumbled and the papers yellowed, only one truth remained. He was never born to be a monster, but they raised him to be one.